Puddle Lane, Tessa and the Magician. Tessa and the Magician. Tessa Catchermouse was a very little cat with very big ears. She lived in the garden of an old house. A magician lived in the house. Tessa lived in a hole under the steps that led to the front door. She lived there with her mother, whose name was Pegs, and her brother, whose name was Tim. Tessa. One day, Tessa woke up very early in the morning. Her mother had gone out to look for food, and her brother was still fast asleep. Tessa woke up. The old house had a big garden. Nobody ever worked in the garden. The grass grew long and the weeds grew wild. It was a wonderful place to play in. Tessa went out into the garden to play. Tessa went out. There was an old tree in the garden. The old tree grew near the house. Tessa ran over to the tree and began to climb up it. She climbed up the tree right up to the top. The old tree. Tessa looked down from the top of the tree. The roof of the old house was just below her. Tessa looked down. Tessa jumped down onto the roof of the old house. Tessa jumped down. She saw a window in the roof. The window was open. Tessa ran up to the window. She looked down into the room below. Tessa looked down. Tessa saw an old man in the room. He was sitting in a chair and he was fast asleep. He had long white hair and a long white beard. He must be the magician, Tessa said to herself. Tessa saw the magician. A big wooden pole was propped up near the window. Tessa looked down at the pole. I think I could climb down that, she said to herself. The magician is fast asleep, and there are all kinds of interesting things in that room. She began to climb down the pole. Tessa looked down. She hadn't gone very far when she found herself near a shelf. Tessa jumped down onto the shelf. There was a jar on the shelf. It was full of sugar mice. There were white mice in the jar, and they were all made out of sugar. Tessa looked at the jar. She was very hungry. Tessa jumped down. There was a label on the jar. It said, "Magic mice for growing ears." Tessa couldn't read the label, but she looked at the sugar mice, and her mouth began to water. She pushed the jar over. The lid fell off, and a white sugar mouse fell out. Tessa ate the mouse. It tasted very good. Tessa ate the mouse. She was just going to eat another mouse when she felt a very funny feeling in her ears. She put up a paw to feel her ears. Her ears were growing longer. Tessa's ears were growing longer. Right, Tessa. She was very frightened. She felt her ears again with her paw. Her ears were growing longer and longer. Tessa's ears were growing longer and longer. Meow, cried Tessa. Meow, meow. She jumped down to the floor. Tessa ran to the magician. Her ears were so big that she couldn't jump up, so she climbed up the magician's leg, just as if she was climbing up a tree. Tessa ran to the magician. The magician woke with a yell of pain. He saw Tessa. "Take your claws out of my leg," cried the magician. "Take your claws out of my leg." "Look at my ears," cried Tessa. "Look at my ears. They won't stop growing." The magician saw Tessa. The magician began to laugh. You silly little cat, he said. You've been eating magic sugar mice. You shouldn't do that. They make your ears grow. Please stop my ears growing, cried Tessa. The magician laughed again. Mice, mice, go back in the jar. Ears, ears, grow as short as you were, he cried. And he snapped his fingers. The magician. At once the jar righted itself. All the white sugar mice flew back into it. Tessa's ears began to grow shorter. They got shorter and shorter and shorter until they were just right. Oh, thank you, cried Tessa. She began to purr. That's all very well, said the magician, but what about my poor leg? I'm sorry about your leg, said Tessa. Tessa and the magician. When Tessa got home again, she told Pegs all about the magician and the sugar mice. You mustn't go and bother magicians, said her mother. They can work magic. I know they can, said Tessa. But he's a very kind magician, isn't he? Tessa and Pegs. Tessa, Pegs, the magician.